Hello, Year 12. I hope your studying is going well for geography. In this video, we are going to look at some of our modernization theories. So, we went over this in one of our lessons in the unit, but I believe that we need to go over it again because it is in our syllabus objectives, so it can be tested. So, what I want you to do is go to our QLearn. So, if we go to our QLearn and go to Unit 4, Topic 2, Global Population Change, so if I click on that one, you will see that we have all our lessons here. Now you see in week 5 we did go over modernization theories, but let's go over it again. If you go down towards our study lessons, as you can see here, there are 3 lessons for you to look at. The last one here is the one we're going to go over. It's going to go over the demographic transition model, Wallersteins world systems theory, and Rostows stages of growth model. So just click on that one for me. You will see that there are some get ready activities already, so some flashcards there for you to use. You should have these flashcards on you. If you do not have the flashcards, by the way, you can find them in the helpful resources section of your QLearn. So let's go down to our must do. So I have 3 PowerPoints here. I did not make these, by the way. I got one on Rostow stages of development, Wallerstein's world systems, and a demographic transition model. And after we go over each of these PowerPoints, there are some questions from previous external exams for you to practice your knowledge that you have learnt. Alright, let's start off with Rostow's stages of development. So with Rostow's stages of development, what is it? It's a model of economic growth suggesting that all countries pass through a series of stages of development as their economy grows. So we can see here, it's a map we've seen a lot of before, and it's just about the countries and their stages of development. In the purple, we see the most advanced economies. They tend to be the most highest developed countries. We tend to see that development also links to our birth and death rates, and that's why we look at these theories. Even though these theories are something we would look more at in um, economics, it links to birth and death rates because the economy always links to that. So we can see we have US and Canada, we have Western Europe, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. They are our most advanced economies. And what we would see in those nations is that our rate of natural increase to the natural increase in the population, the difference between birth and death rates, is quite low or could be potentially negative, as we see in Germany and Japan. A lot of those countries take in migration to counteract that. In transition, we have a lot of Eastern Europe. Now, this map is a little bit old. There are some new nations in transition. So, for example, Brazil, India, and China would normally be considered in transition as well. So, they're moving through those economic stages. It means that they have economic hubs with like dense cities with skyscrapers, factories, manufacturing, but they still also have lots of rural areas that are more poor and traditional. Then we have our less developed countries in the orange, and then our least developed in the red. So our 5 stages. First stage is the traditional society. Rostow believed that each country went through these 5 stages at some point in their lifespan. So we can see on the x-axis it shows the time in decades. So we have our traditional society. We then move to the preconditions for takeoff. When it's talking about takeoff, it's talking about takeoff of the economy. Then we have third stage is the takeoff. The fourth stage is the drive to maturity, and the fifth stage is the age of high mass consumption. So let's have a look at the first stage. So our stage 1 is traditional society. It's dominated by subsistence agriculture. So agriculture where it's just enough normally to feed the population. It's not really used to sell globally to other countries. So they have an agricultural based economy. It's an economy that is mostly internal. They don't sell much externally. They have intensive labor and low levels of trading. They have a population that has no scientific perspective on the world and technology. So these tend to be our least developed countries. What do we notice with our least developed countries? Well, they have very high birth rates, but they also have very high death rates. So their population does increase, but not that much because of both birth and death rates being very high. Now, after our traditional society, a country will move to the preconditions to take off. So that's setting up all the basic infrastructure for their economy to take off. So we can see it says society begins to develop manufacturing. A country advances to a more complex economy, beginning of economic development. The levels of technology develop, the development of a transport system, and then Rostow also believed that this could only be achieved by a great achievement of a surplus of wealth. So what we see in the world is a lot of first world nations, more economically developed countries, tend to send a lot of foreign aid and investment to our traditional societies in stage one to set up these preconditions to take off. What are those preconditions? It's things like paved roads, electricity grid, running water, sanitation. All of those things is some preconditions you need to have. Also, some sort of transport hub, be it airports or some sort of dock. You need those to actually set up the basis of a global economy. So that is stage two. After a country sets up all their preconditions to take off, they can finally move to stage three, the actual takeoff period where they move into that global economy. So we have a short period of extensive growth. Their economy just grows rapidly. Industrialization begins. So manufacturing becomes part of the economy. So it's not just agriculture. Introductions to technical innovations as well. So the economy rises. Agriculture progresses to commercial rather than subsistence. And during this stage as well, we should also see an improvement in people's lives. So uh, people will have more wealth. The government will have more wealth, meaning they can spend it on more social things like um, pensions, could spend it on healthcare, education. And what we notice then is at this stage, the death rate should start dropping, but birth rates may still remain high, and that's when we see in this takeoff period countries' population rapidly expanding. And we see this in a lot of African nations, such as Nigeria, Kenya, Ethiopia, where they are starting this early stage of the takeoff period. After the takeoff period, we move the drive to maturity. The country has had a global economic system for quite a while. They start maturing. It takes place over a long period of time. The standards of living rise. The use of technology increases. The national economy grows and diversifies, and increased percentage of nations' wealth is invested into developing its economy. During the strive to maturity, this is where we see also the birth rates will start dropping, as we have things like women in the workforce, we have higher education rates, and because we have a lower death rate, people do not need to have as many children. So this is how it links in to our population, which is our topic. And then our stage five, this is the very wealthiest nations, the most developed nations, such as Australia, are in stage five, where the individuals in the society have so much income that the economy runs on high mass consumption as well. So, for instance, we all buy lots of things that we don't necessarily need, we just want them. And that grows the economy. For instance, you may want a phone or a TV or a laptop, whatever it is, It's something that is a want, not a need. It helps expand the economy. It's a high mass consumption when we do it over a great scale where our whole population is doing that. During this stage as well, we have improved healthcare systems and education. The economy flourishes. We have a growing demand for additional consumer goods and services. And this is where we see in stage 5 that birth rate and death rate tend to level out a lot. They tend to be quite similar. And this is where we see some countries kind of stagnate in their rate of natural increase. And some countries, such as Germany or Japan, start to decrease in population as their birth rates drop so rapidly. So there are our 5 stages. So now let's move on to Wallerstein's world systems theory. It's similar to Rostow's, but it shows it in a different way. So let's have a look. So I'll just wait for it to load. Here we go. So Wallerstein's world systems theory is created by Immanuel Wallerstein, a professor of sociology. Now, here's world systems theory. This is the type of um, diagram you would see normally. So world systems theory states that there is a worldwide system in which some countries exploit and others are exploited. There are 3 types of countries. We have our core countries, as we can see in the red. We have our periphery in the green and semi-periphery in the blue. So with our core countries, they tend to be our nations that are most developed. They have the most developed economies, lots of wealth, the individuals within the country, the individuals within the country are quite wealthy. Then we have our periphery. They tend to be our poorest nations. So, our core countries tend to exploit our periphery countries, our poorest nations, by buying their cheap labor and raw materials. We buy their cheap labor, their raw materials, and we turn it into high profit consumption goods. So we change it into things like cars or laptops, or we change into phones. We grab those cheap raw materials, we change into those manufactured goods, and we sell it back to those periphery nations. Then we have semi-periphery in the middle that is a little bit of both. So let's first look at our core nations. Our core countries are industrial, capitalistic countries which uses peripheral countries' resources and labor. The core countries support the global economy that peripheral countries rely on, and they're mostly dominant countries. How does this relate to population? Well, again, this is showing development. These countries, the core countries, tend to be the most developed. If they are the most developed, they tend to have a lower birth rate and a very low death rate. These countries tend to be ones in Western Europe, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and the US, and also Japan and South Korea tend to be our core countries. We then move on to our semi-peripheral countries. So our semi-periphery countries share both characteristics of core and peripheral. These countries are normally at a tipping point where they have redeeming factors but limits as well. So that tends to be countries where they have a mixture of a big manufacturing base, let's say like China or Brazil or South Africa, but they still have lots of areas where it's a rural areas where there's so many people who are impoverished and still are relying on the cheap labor aspect or agriculture. So in China, there are so many megacities where we can see that manufacturing taking place, but there's still so much rural area where there is impoverished people. So they count as semi-peripheral. They have characteristics of both the core and periphery. Now we move on to our peripheral countries. So they're countries that are dependent on their core opposites for trade. Rarely is the trade equally balanced because core countries want while peripheral need, and peripherals are impoverished and often corrupt. These countries tend to be, most of them, in Africa. Okay? we can see our core, semi-periphery, and periphery here. Again, this is a slightly old map. There are a few countries that you would say have likely moved from that periphery stage to semi-periphery. I would say Russia is a country that is semi-periphery. Why is that? Because they do have some cities like St. Petersburg and Moscow that are definitely characteristics of core. They have higher levels of development. They have manufacturing. People's wealth and health are quite good, but then they have so much rural area that is very, very impoverished. So they should be counted as semi-periphery. We have our core. There's an example, and semi-periphery. This one's showing the peripheral and it's showing Russia. I disagree. If you were to try and get an example of a peripheral country, well, I would pick one like, let's go with like Democratic Republic of Congo. Some of the Central African nations would tend to be our peripheral. All right. So moving on to one that I know that you are more familiar with, the demographic transition model. So demographic transition model. We have some questions here you can complete. So I'm just going to skip that one. Here we go. Here's our demographic transition model. We've seen this many times. The black line there is going to show our death rate. The grey line is showing our birth rate. The green color in between our birth and death rate is showing our natural increase in our population, how much our population expands. And in the red line is showing our total population. Each country should go eventually in their lifetime through each of these stages. Now, stage 5 here has a question mark. That's only because currently we only have really 2 countries that are in stage 5. So some sociologists are still a little bit unsure whether every country would go through a stage 5, but that's still there anyway. So, moving on. Stage 1. So at this stage, the population is not growing, and the number of people is small. This is because the birth rate and the death rate are both high. So no country currently, we would say, is in stage 1. Stage 1 is most countries that would be in there would probably be from maybe 100 years ago. Currently, we could say that maybe some remote areas where there's some tribes, where there's no healthcare at all, or no level of development or technology, would still have a high birth and high death rate. So the birth rate is high because of lack of family planning, high infant mortality rate, need for workers in agriculture, religious beliefs, and then children as economic assets. The death rate is high because high level of disease, famine, lack of clean water and sanitation, lack of healthcare, war, and competition for food from predators such as rats, and lack of education. Stage 2, there are countries in stage 2. So here the number of people are starting to grow as the death rate starts to fall, but the birth rate remains quite high. So these countries would be considered Afghanistan, Bhutan, and Laos, and a lot of our African nations as well. So the reasons for the declining death rate. So why does the death rate start declining? Normally we have an improvement in healthcare. Now, I'm not saying that we have healthcare like we do here in Australia or other developed nations, but we have some sort of healthcare comes in, some form, that's going to decrease the death rate. We can have improvement in hygiene. Water for drinking might be boiled. Improvement in sanitation, so maybe the development of toilets. Improved food production and storage. Improved transport for food, and decreased infant mortality rates. What does that mean? Well, that means in stage 2, your country's population will start expanding because your birth rates are still high and your death rates are starting to decrease. So we move into stage 3. So at this stage, the population is growing very rapidly, but the gap between the birth and death rates is starting to become narrower. At this stage, the natural increase is high. So this is where we see the countries where their population is rapidly expanding. The birth rates do start to drop though. It's just that they're not dropping at the same as the same depth as their death rates. So the reasons for this are family planning becomes available, lower infant mortality rate, increased mechanization reduces the need for workers, and increased standard of living and the changing status of women. We move to stage 4. In stage 4, the total population is high, but it's no longer growing very quickly. This is because the birth rate and death rate are balanced as both are now low. And then finally, stage 5. So stage 5 occurs currently in Japan and Germany, and it's a country normally where when we look at their pyramid, their population pyramid, it tends to have a very old population. So their birth rates are really low, but their death rate starts to increase because it's such an old population that there are more older people dying than younger people being born. And so due to that, their population actually decreases. So that's the 5 stages of the demographic transition model. Now, in the demographic transition model, it doesn't take into account some other characteristics. So, what are limitations? It does not include the number of people migrating to an area. So, for instance, Australia is in stage 4. We should have a pretty stable population, but we take in lots of migrants to expand our population. That's deliberate. That's to try and expand our economy and help with our aging population. It does not take into account that. It assumes that all countries will go through the same process of development, and development will not happen equally and at the same rates for each country. There is no time scale, and the reasons for birth and death rates changing can be for very different reasons in different countries. So for instance, Ukraine is a country that is currently showing stage 5 development characteristics. Their population is decreasing. They have an old population, but they are not the most developed nation. Why might this be? Well, it could be because of the European Union. The people in that country could move um, to other countries and work there. Maybe because there's a war there as well. We see a lot of younger people leaving. So it's not taking into account characteristics like that. So what I would like you to do now, based on your knowledge there, write down some notes for each one, go down to the Give Me More here, and complete some of these questions. Now with these questions, there are answers to them if you go to the helpful resources section. You will see that there are the 3 external exams, and with there are marking guides. On the marking guides, there are answers to these questions. Thank you for watching.